you guys continue to teach me over and over again that sometimes the production value really means nothing, and it really is all about the story or the person who's presenting the video or just what they have to say. So today I'm going to be babbling about the Beatles because I think that my entire music interest, and music is a huge part of who I am and what I do and how I live, and I think it all goes back to the Beatles. So let's go back. Let's go way on back to when I was growing up at my parents' house back in the day, like late 80s, early 90s. And my parents had a record player. I have one behind me. And I have many of my parents' records here and a few of my own that I've collected over the years. And for instance, this is my dad's copy of Sgt. Pepper. This includes all the nifty things that, if you're going to look for that Paul is dead thing, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. All of that hidden stuff is in here. For instance, George is thumbing up his thumb at the lyric "Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock," which is supposedly when Paul died. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. Maybe I'll put a link in the info to the Paul is dead myth. But anyway. When I was growing up, 1990-ish, and like when you're a kid, sometimes you don't know what pop music is. Like, you have a concept of the radio, and you have a concept of what your parents listen to, because what my parents listened to around that time and what pop music was were definitely two separate things. I remember my parents being really heavy into Billy Joel. My mom's really big into Elton John. My dad's okay with Elton John. Not as crazy about him as my mom is. Conversely, my dad is really into Paul McCartney and specifically, I'm sorry, I gave it away, the Beatles and specifically Paul McCartney. My mom is like, meh, take him or leave him. And my only, by the way, before I get too far, my only restraint for you guys, for the comments, please don't tell me you don't like the Beatles. I don't care if you don't like the Beatles, but you don't need to be like, I hate the Beatles and I don't understand why anyone likes them. Don't contribute that to the discussion. If you don't like the Beatles, just keep on moving, or tell me why you like Elton John. So anyway, I had like all these like 60s, 70s kind of icons that they were the music that I listened to. In fact, the first CD that I was given by my parents, hello Appa, was Paul is Live, a live album by Paul McCartney that he recorded in the 90s sometime. Cat, get away! I have to deal with this all the time when I'm recording. I just always cut it out because there's always like a cat trying to bump into the tripod. So, when I was little and I was listening to pop music, which basically for me as a kid involved like Weird Al, it still involves Weird Al, and I was listening to what my parents listened to, the one thing that kind of crossed the line, like I could tell my parents listened to and was a huge part of history in some way, like even at a very young age, I got that impression, was the Beatles. When I was that little, I couldn't even begin to fathom the impact that they had on music or the world. And as I got older and I saw more, and when I was right around 11, 12, the anthology albums came out, the anthology video set, whatever. And I've actually watched that entire thing twice now. I watched it when I was that age, when it first aired, because it was on TV. And I rewatched it like 2 years ago. I found it, I bought it and I watched it on DVD. And it's a fascinating story. If you're at all interested in the Beatles or the development of pop music in the 60s, you owe it to yourself to check it out. It's a fascinating piece of archaeology of music history. So I understood this overlap. Like my dad really likes the Beatles, but the world really likes the Beatles. Like it's clearly not just something my dad's into. It's not like Steely Dan. Like my dad likes Steely Dan, but I would say overall pop music doesn't look at Steely Dan and say like, oh yeah, #1 hit songwriters over and over and over. I mean, they've got what, Peg and Ricky, Don't Lose That Number. Do they have any other greatest hits? Probably not. So I understood their importance, and I already liked them. Like as a kid, it's hard not to like the Beatles because their music is practically like, on this side of the century, it feels like roots music to us. Like in the 60s, in the 60s or 70s, if you're going to play roots, you're going to play like what Clapton did. Clapton took a 1920s song called Crossroads by Robert Johnson and updated it and used the basic blues roots to make a hit song called Crossroads that he has basically, most people just know Crossroads as an Eric Clapton song, not as a Robert Johnson song, which at this point is almost 100 years old. So on this end of the century, looking back at the Beatles, it almost seems like they are the roots music of our time. They are the people who artists now go look at and they draw from. And the Beatles obviously drew from the people before them, most noticeably Buddy Holly and Elvis, and even some of their contemporaries. Paul has said over and over again that this album, which is my favorite Beatles album, and I think is the best album ever made. Don't get on me with the concept. People have problems with the concept album because it's not really a concept album, but it's supposed to be, but it isn't. Paul has said that album, Sgt. Pepper, is directly influenced by the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, which came out the year before that. And when I listen to it, I don't get any of that feeling that he did, but for some reason he did. And as I'm growing up and I'm listening to the Beatles and I go to school and I talk about the Beatles with my friends, and there are very few kids who got the Beatles or who bothered to listen to them because they had parents that didn't care what they listened to, so they were always listening to pop radio. And at that point, let's see, what was popular? There was I guess Sublime was popular around that time, like late elementary school, middle school age for me, like 13, 14. Sublime, Pearl Jam, Red Hot Chili Peppers, and these were all groups that I vaguely knew of, but wasn't interested in, and even if I was interested in them, I probably wouldn't have been allowed to listen to them because my parents, specifically my mom, no, I'm not blaming, I'm not saying, I'm not complaining, I'm just saying my parents were a little restrictive. My mom didn't like when lyrics were extremely overt. She didn't like swearing in songs. I had a neighbor who lived across the street who made a Pearl Jam tape for me, and he actually did specifically pick songs that did not have swear words in them for me so that I could listen to it. And that was the first time I heard Even Flow, but I'm getting away from the Beatles. So I wasn't listening to that pop music that my friends were, so I was kind of the oddball, and that wasn't a bad thing because as a musician, and I was learning to play piano at that time, I took lessons for piano from the time I was 5, yes 5, until I was 12. Maybe it was 6. Not sure if it was 5 or 6, but it was definitely by the age of 6 I was taking piano lessons. I quit when I was 12. I can still play. I can still sight read pretty well, not quickly. There are a few things I can play off the top of my head. I still know how to play major and minor chords and that stuff, but when I was 12 I quit to play the drums, and that's all basically I've done since. I have a guitar, but I don't pretend that I can play it. I dabble is what I do. And as I listened to the Beatles, they really informed my music listening. So when I would listen to other groups, I could determine how they compared to the Beatles, or where they might have gotten an idea from the Beatles. And whenever I would read an interview with bands that I liked, if they would mention the Beatles, I would be like, oh my gosh, it really is. It really just ties together everywhere. And they had such a profound effect on my childhood that I think I've seen the movie Help. Hold on, it's right here. This is an awful like rip-off DVD copy that I got for Christmas one time. I would like the actual... They have like a collector's edition at this point. This is MPI home video. It's got like scratches and dust, and I don't... If this movie was shot in widescreen, this DVD is not in widescreen. Anyway, I watched this movie with my dad because, in case you don't know, the Beatles had 4 movies. The first one was A Hard Day's Night. That's in black and white. It's funny. It's a comedy. Very English humor. The boys, you can tell that their acting is kind of, I don't know, it's just kind of stilted and weird. A lot of people seem to like that movie the most. I like this movie the most. Help is in color. It was shot by the same guy. What's his name? Richard Lester. The boys have... I'm going to keep calling them the boys because that's what people always called them. The boys were much better actors by that point. John especially. John is hysterical in this movie. Paul always kind of wanted to act, and you can tell in this movie maybe he's trying a little too hard. He continued to try too hard throughout the rest of his career. George is clearly the one who does not want to act, and Ringo went on to act, so there's something to be said about that. But this movie is very English as well. I think the comedy flows a lot better. It's a lot easier for an American audience to find funny and understand. And then after that movie, to try and wiggle out of their contract, because they did have a deal that they had to make 4 films, to try and get around it, they commissioned an animated film called Yellow Submarine that they had absolutely no confidence in. And they were sure it was going to be stupid, and they were sure it was going to fail. And they gave it a bunch of songs, including Yellow Submarine, that they thought were just crap. And they were like, this will just go away, and then we can worry about the 4th film and just forget about it. And in case you don't know what Yellow Submarine is like, I'll include a link in the info to something about it. Okay. What was the first thing I was going to include a link to? I don't remember. I'm going to have to go back and watch this. Yellow Submarine is a very psychedelic, very late 60s kind of film. And it has such a specific style that it continues to be ripped off to this day. I saw a commercial within the last 2 months that specifically ripped off the Yellow Submarine's animation style. And it made me really happy, a little mad, but very happy that that is, like, people are still doing that. And the thing about that movie that they expected to be awful and fail is when they watched it, they freaking loved it. At that point, they were all doing, kids, don't do drugs. At that point, they were all doing LSD. Some of them may have been experimenting with other things. They'd all been smoking weed since like 1965. Elvis introduced them to it. Thanks, Elvis. And that movie, I'm sure, is enhanced by viewing it in an altered state because it's just that kind of movie. So they loved it. It turned out that they loved it, and they shot a little epilogue for it that used the song All Together Now, which was already in the movie, but they didn't have any other songs to use, so they just used that again. And then their 4th film, still another famous Beatles thing, is the Let It Be documentary, which famously ends with them doing the rooftop concert at Abbey Road in London and getting shut down by the police. It's a very famous event in music history. And if you don't know what I'm talking about and you're too young, maybe I'll link that in the info as well. So, I went to school with all this knowledge about like the Beatles' humor in their films and the Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds lyrics, and everyone else was just kind of like, hmm? And then when I started getting into bands, even then, I still had trouble finding people who really like got it, who really understood, like, even if you don't like the Beatles, they did something for all music. From then on, they changed music, and it could never go back to the way it was. And I played with one guy in high school, and then I guess that band disbanded before the end of high school. Who really did? He got the Beatles, and he understood George Harrison, and he was a guitar player, and him and I got along famously, and him and I would just jam constantly. And again, that doesn't necessarily have to do with the Beatles, but it has to do with an understanding of music as a whole. And jamming is like an art form, And it's probably easier to jam on drums than a lot of other instruments, but because he had that basic knowledge instilled in him that he found, like starting from the Beatles and moving forward, it was like the building blocks that you need to jam well or write good songs or whatever. And I have a feeling I'm getting a little longer than I want to, and I want to keep on talking about the Beatles, but I want to organize my thoughts. So I'm going to leave it here on video number 1 on Shawn Babbles about the Beatles, and we'll pick it up next time. Now I have to turn off the camera.